I've always been attracted to a different way of working, so the ultimate workbench never appealed to me. Instead, I moved towards something more minimalist. There's not much space here in the New York City area, so I needed a modular setup that works in a tight corner of my living room. Thankfully, Japanese tools are designed to be used in small spaces. This was my first workbench. I used it every day in my tiny studio Brooklyn apartment, and here's the bench I'm using now. It's just a larger version of the small one I started with. There are 2 feet dadoed into the bottom of the bench. On the smaller one, I use tapered sliding dovetails. This helps keep the tops flat over time. On the top, there are 2 plane stops dovetailed into it on one end that I use to pull against. I can take them in and out depending on what I'm working on. Even though my space is a little bigger now, this modular setup still works really well for me. To finish out this workbench, I'm going to build some sawhorses with simple joinery. After that, I'll talk about how I put this simple workbench to use. trade-off with this simple way of working is that you have to use your body and instincts to get accurate results instead of outsourcing to machines. To me, this feels more raw, primal even, but also delicate and sensitive. You have to learn to understand the tools and the wood. It takes an intimate relationship to both in order to make good work. Now that these are complete, I'll show all the different ways I use my workbench. The first thing with this style bench is putting the feet against the sawhorses. Everything is designed to be pulled against. When cross-cutting, I use a bench hook to pull against. This one isn't pretty, but it gets the job done for now. The plane stops that are dovetailed into my bench are incredibly versatile. When laying out joinery, for example, I can lay out an entire joint very quickly by simply marking and rotating the piece using the stops on every side without ever having to clamp it in a vise. There are a few ways that I use saws with this setup. The first is pulling down into the bench like this, bringing the force of the cut through the sawhorses into the ground. I'm constantly flipping and moving the pieces to get through all the cuts very quickly. For cutting shoulders, I often use the bench hook again to pull against. This gives me a nice stable surface to get accurate cuts. Another way to saw is by putting the bench on the ground, slightly elevated, then standing on the workpiece and ripping through. This is the best way to get long, straight rips, as it's easier to keep the saw blade in a straight line. If I need to pare down a joint, I push into the stops using my chisel. Sharp tools go through any kind of grain with ease. When I've got a board that's longer than my bench, I can move the plane stops in and out to accommodate the longer length. To square up a piece, I use a flat board to elevate the wood and pull my plane on its side, always making sure the plane side is square to its sole to get a nice square edge. For rough lumber, I remove the bench top and just use the sawhorses. Everything is movable, so changing between tasks easily gets me the most use out of my workspace. I can make pretty much anything while still having a small workshop. When chopping out any kind of mortises or chisel work, I place all the parts on my bench, then place a cushion on top. I usually use a pair of lower sawhorses for this, but don't currently have them in my shop. So for now, I'm using my toolbox to raise my feet up. I sit down on the parts, using my body as a clamp, and move through each mortise. And finally, if I need some extra help, I'll just clamp on my workbench. This is so versatile and allows a lot of room to be creative while working in a space that requires me to be modular. Keeping my setup simple requires more focus and sensitivity from me. It keeps my mind centered. Instead of thinking of how I can control this material to do what I want it to do, I have to learn how to flow with all of it. Keeping my setup simple and using traditional methods has allowed me to focus on what truly matters to me, to make beautiful things with wood. If you're interested in learning more about this beautiful craft, I've created a buyer's guide for Japanese hand tools, along with plans for this workbench. I've got many more resources coming soon, so sign up for the newsletter to hear about them when they drop. Links down below. Thanks for watching.